I'm going to spend a few minutes with you today talking about symbolic interactionism, which is a micro-level perspective that you are all now familiar with after this morning's discussion. So just again, a brief reminder, when we talk about micro-level theories or perspectives, we're really talking about close-up, on-the-ground studies of oftentimes social interaction as well as human behavior and how individuals interpret and respond to and ascribe meaning to interactions and to particular behaviors. And so as Simone introduced us to several of these thinkers earlier, George Herbert Mead and Charles Horton Cooley are often two of the thinkers that are sort of considered foundational. But as Simone said, Herbert Blumer was actually the first scholar to use the term of symbolic interactionism in his written work. And Blumer was a student of Mead's at the University of Chicago. Robert Park as well as Irving Goffman are also oftentimes names that you will see in this tradition. And it's interesting, sort of as Simone was alluding to, when you're working in a contemporary theoretical space, figuring out who are those founding thinkers. And so Mead sometimes gets included as a classical thinker in sociology because oftentimes he is the one that, like I did this morning, people point to as sort of a foundational thinker of the micro-interactionist approach, but also is oftentimes taught in contemporary theory classes as well. And so a few of the central premises of symbolic interactionism, and these first three, I'm going to put up several premises or ideas that really help anchor this theory. So while Mead is oftentimes sort of the person who's pointed to as one of the grand founders of this theory, he actually, his most read book, Mind, Self, and Society, he actually did not write. His students at the University of Chicago were so taken by him and his ideas and the things that he shared that after he passed away, his students actually assembled that book based on notes from his lectures in his class. Blumer, his student, was much more systematic in terms of his writing about what symbolic interactionism is. And recall, Mead was a philosopher, a psychologist, and also a sociologist, as to where Blumer was a capital S sociologist. And so these first three premises are his. So the first thing he would say is that people act towards symbols. And so this notion of symbols is key in symbolic interactionism. And when we use the concept of symbols, we're really talking about, first and foremost, words and language. But we're also talking about material goods. We may be talking about actual physical objects or items or things. And so people act in relation to symbols, and they do this on the basis of those meanings that those symbols have for them. And so, for instance, we have some people who are US born and bred in this room. We also have many people who are not. We also likely have many people of many different political and ideological stripes sitting in this room. And so what a symbolic interactionist would, their starting point would recognize this flag is a symbol. It's an object. And a symbolic interactionist would maybe put up a symbol like this and would never assume that all of us ascribe the same meaning to this. Instead, a symbolic interactionist would look at this room and would want to try to understand, so there's this symbol, what meaning do each of you attach to this symbol? So if you would, let's take 5 seconds, and I'd like you to think about what is the first word or idea that comes into your mind when you see the American flag, and no need to share it because we're being recorded. So what's the first word or idea? Again, get it in your mind, please. Second tenet or premise of symbolic interactionism is that the meanings that we ascribe to symbols, they come through interactions with people. And so think about that word that you just put into your mind to describe your feeling or how you might respond to the American flag. Where did that idea come from for you? Was it your family? Was it your broader cultural context? Was it the media, etc.? Third key premise of symbolic interactionism is that people don't just internalize meanings. It's not that meanings aren't all around us, but we don't just internalize them. We're able to actually interact with them through an interpretive process. And so at all times, symbolic interactionists see people as active, critical, engaged beings who are able to think critically and actively about the symbols around them. Fourth key premise, that one of the things that symbolic interactionists argue separate us from the animals, and we'll love to hear our veterinarian weigh in on this, is that we are unique in our ability to use and rely on symbols. We are not just driven by our instincts. Instead, we are very much active and interactive in our society. Fifth key premise is that people only become human through social interaction. And so some symbolic interactionists actually argue that we are not actually human until we acquire the ability to use language, because language is so central to the symbolic interactionist perspective. And so it's through language and through interaction that we actually become fully human. And so a lot of early interactionists actually wrote about feral children and children who had been raised by wolves to argue that they weren't actually fully human because they had not developed this capacity to interact with their environment and the symbols around them. Sixth key premise, that people are conscious and capable of reflecting on themselves and what they do, and thus they're therefore capable of shaping their actions and their interactions with others. And so this small graphic up here of the looking glass self, this is sort of Cooley's, who's one of the founding thinkers. This is oftentimes the idea that oftentimes gets most cited and associated with him. And so the looking glass self is this idea that we're able to hold a mirror up to ourselves and realize that our parents may see us in a particular way, our partners may see us in a particular way, and the ways that our partners see us can change across time and space based upon our behavior. And so while the mom may see the person with a halo around their head, and while the girlfriend may generally see the person as okay, later in time the girlfriend may see the person as horns on their head because they did something bad. And so this looking glass self is this idea that we're constantly able to understand and interpret how people are seeing us, and then we behave in ways in response to that. Seventh key idea is that people define situations, they give them meaning, and then they act toward them. And so reality is socially constructed, and it's constantly being constructed. Oftentimes people teaching the symbolic interactionist perspective in an intro class to make this point about people defining situations as real and then they become real in their meaning. A lot of times intro classes use the example of someone who is anorexic. And so if the person defines a situation as real, so an anorexic, we know that oftentimes when they look at themselves, they see themselves as being heavy, even if objectively out there in the so-called real world, other people are looking at that person and saying, oh my goodness, you are drastically, dramatically underweight, your life is being threatened. It doesn't matter what that objective reality is out there for that anorexic person. If that anorexic person defines his or her reality as being, I am heavy, I am atrociously overweight, I am not going to be able to eat, then that is how that person is going to respond in reaction to their socially constructed reality. And so symbolic interactionists, this morning we heard the word objectivity several times out there. Symbolic interactionists tend to be less interested in big O objectivity as floating out there in the world somewhere, and instead much more interested in subjective interpretations of our social world. And eighth key premise is that people produce society. And so that structure agency debate that we talked about this morning, that society is seen very much as a bottom-up construction made as a result of these ongoing interactions between people with symbols, selves, and society. And so just in conclusion, when we think about how do symbolic interactionists, how do they look at the world? What is the lens, the magnifying glass that they bring to everything that they do? And so these are generalizations. Symbolic interactionists, like many other sociologists of many other stripes, look at the world in many different ways. But generally speaking, symbolic interactionists tend to look at individuals as well as small groups in terms of their unit of analysis. and hence have a lot of overlap with social psychologists. There's also a society for the study of symbolic interactionism that is its own disciplinary organization. In terms of methods, because symbolic interactionists tend to be interested in that kind of micro-level group behavior, they tend to, although not exclusively, tend to use qualitative participatory methods, so interviews, observations, small group interviews, and they tend to be inductive in their forms of analysis. And the questions that they ask tend to be focused on identities, interactions, behaviors, attitudes, values, and group affiliations. And so in terms of implications for a group like this, and thinking about where might a microsociology or a symbolic interactionist perspective really assist or aid people working in this kind of space. So we might ask questions like, how does someone develop an identity as an environmental activist? What does it mean to become an activist? How do environmental activists interact with one another, and how is that conditioned by race, class, gender, and age? What are particular environmental values that people hold, and how are those values, how might they be changed by interactions with institutions, with political systems, and so forth? And so these are some of the questions that people working in a symbolic interactionist frame, working in an environmental space, have asked and have shed a lot of light on environmental attitudes and environmental change.